Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Columbia Business School webinar on analytics in the time of Corona. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. Probably a testament to how relevant and interesting this topic is to all of us today. I think we all know the toll these unprecedented times have taken on us and our families, but it's perhaps easy to forget how much goes on behind the scenes and how much of the analytics that we've grown to rely on will have been disrupted by these changing circumstances. So I'm very much looking forward to our next hour together to discuss this topic. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Daniel Guerra. I'm a professor here at the Business School, and I'm going to be moderating our panel together today. I'm delighted to be joined by four fantastic speakers from four quite different industries, actually, that will hopefully give us different perspectives on this question. And I'd love to invite each one of them to introduce themselves one by one before we begin. So let me begin with Greg Chapman, Director of Resorts Revenue Management at the Walt Disney Company. Greg, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Like I said, Greg Chapman. I'm Director of the resort hotels in the domestic U.S., so the Walt Disney World hotels, the Disneyland hotels, and then we have a couple of coastal resorts, one in Hawaii, Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and then Vero Beach. Been with the company for about 27 years. The vast majority of that has been in the revenue management space. I did spend some time in finance as well as operations. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Central Florida and my MBA from the University of Alabama.
Wonderful. Next, let me call upon Wei Kerr, who's managing partner at Simon-Kucher.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. My name is Wei Kerr. I'm a graduate of Columbia Business School with a PhD back in 2008-2009 timeframe. I also have an undergraduate degree with Columbia, so I'm sort of a lifer with Columbia University. I'm currently a managing partner with Simon-Kucher, where we are the world's largest pricing specialist consulting firm. 1,400 people worldwide, 40 offices around the world. And in my current capacity, I primarily focus on two sectors. One is financial services and the other is travel, leisure, and transportation. In my spare time, I also adjunct teach a course at Columbia Business School in pricing analytics.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wei. And next, let me move to Aaron Putnam, who's Vice President of Advanced Analytics at the Avis Budget Group.
Hi, I'm Aaron Putnam. I lead the science and analytics team here at Avis Budget. We rent rental cars. So Avis Budget, Zipcar, Payless brands within the United States. And then we have a couple of others in Europe and Australia as well. So I've been with Avis Budget now for 5 years. Prior to that, I was at Pros Revenue Management software for 17 years. I have an undergrad and master's in industrial engineering from Texas A&M University.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aaron. And finally, last but certainly not least, Ren Zhang, who's the Chief Data Scientist at the Bank of Montreal.
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here. So I'm the Chief Data Scientist for BMO Financial. BMO is a financial institution ranked number 8 probably in North America when it comes to assets under management. It provides products from retail to business banking to commercial and capital markets. So for me, I'm the head of AI Center of Excellence for BMO. So this is an enterprise function. My team does automation through robotics and through machine learning and AI capability. Throughout my career, I have always been in financial institutions, have been with American Express for quite some time, and then Commonwealth Bank of Australia and then Prudential. So good to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ren, and thank you so much on behalf of everyone here to the four of you for taking the time to join us today. So just before I jump in, one quick point of logistics for our audience. I'd love to make this as interactive as can be in this kind of crazy format we've had to get used to these days. So I want to bring your attention to the Q&A box that you will see right below our faces. Please feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the webinar. I'll address them as they arise if appropriate, or else we'll keep them for a Q&A session at the end. And thank you also to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We'll try to address them if we can. All right, So let's now jump straight in. And I think before we talk about how the pandemic has turned everything upside down, it might be helpful to actually begin and set the scene and discuss some of the most impactful ways you were using analytics before this hit even, in some sense to sort of set the scene. And perhaps I'll go to each of the four of you to ask you to talk to that, perhaps beginning with Aaron, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, absolutely. So, we use analytics across the board throughout the company in many different areas. So, at our core, we rent cars to our customers, and then we also have a sales component where we have to ultimately dispose of our vehicles and sell those vehicles. So, we are using analytics from where do the customers want the cars, how do we position those cars, how do we get them to what they want, what type of car, all the way to that they want to rent, all the way to where do they want the cars when they want to purchase them, and where how do we get those to the customers there. And in between in operations, we use analytics around connected vehicles and understanding how to leverage that information for maintenance and repairs and various things like that. So it's exciting, it's fun, got a lot of challenging problems. So yep.
Fantastic, really broad range of applications. And let me go to you, Ren, perhaps now to describe how BMO sort of uses analytics.
Absolutely. We use analytics, I would say, throughout the customer lifecycle and in all aspects of our business as well. I'll give you several examples. Just take my team as, since we're enterprise function, we engage with all business units. So we have been using analytics in the financial crime unit to fighting cyber attack and potential fraud attacks. We also use analytics on the digital front, use that to personalize customers' online experience and give them relevant message and the right product recommendation. We also use analytics when it comes to even for climate change prediction to understand how it's going to impact our business in the long run. And naturally, you would imagine we use analytics when it comes to credit risk decision. Also, where we partner close with Way will be on the pricing side. How do we make sure we offer the right price and reach the ultimate outcome? And servicing side is another example. How do we make sure that we minimize the customer complaint and make sure we route their calls the most effective way. So those are some of the examples, and there's many other examples we use to drive efficiency and the best customer experience.
Wonderful. And in fact, since we talked about pricing, it makes sense to move on to Wei and talk a little bit about some of the ways you've used analytics.
Sure. I mean, if we qualify that for the period we were in over the past few months, I think there's one interesting use case that's sort of in the financial services world. We've had a large bank client that wanted to understand how customer behaviors have actually changed or not changed. So either way during the pandemic, and as you can imagine, people don't go to the branches anymore, and a lot of transactions are online. And at the same time, stock market has been going up and down quite wildly. And so if you're running, for example, a deposit portfolio, so savings accounts and so forth at a bank, you typically wonder what people are actually doing during this period. And essentially what you want to do is to avoid any knee-jerk reactions in going out with a promotional campaign that on the one hand might be triggering a price war if you're in a somewhat oligopolistic marketplace. On the other hand, it could also be that you're doing this while the whole world is sort of hunkered down. So it might be a PR disaster if you're going out trying to win more business during this time. So using analytics, you can actually get to very detailed behaviors at the individual customer level in terms of how they actually move money between different accounts, and hopefully with that aggregated to the product portfolio level, you could determine whether money is still within your own bank, meaning it's just flowing to a different product area as opposed to going outside, which might indicate the need for running promotions. I think that kind of a clarity is super important during this time.
Fantastic. And finally, we move to you, Greg, Disney.
Sure, and it's fun because when I talk about analytics at Disney, we like to talk about it starting within my organization in 1995 when we first introduced the science-based revenue management system for our resorts. So we grew out of that. So we continue that, the traditional revenue management of forecasting and optimizing our resort demand. But we've moved into more personalization analytics. So thinking about as the customers are going through the buying experience, whether it's online or through our call center, personalizing that, but also then using that information to analyze the effectiveness of our promotional activity. So we do use a lot of analytics for that. But then as we grew, we've also started to become, within my organization, we have almost an internal consulting group that goes out and helps the different parts of the Walt Disney Company. So we've now helped to apply analytics throughout almost every aspect of the company. If you look at Disney Theatrical, that was one of the first places we went, helping them with pricing of their seats, particularly for The Lion King on Broadway. We also we do work today with the studio, using analytics as they think about their marketing effectiveness and placement as a motion picture is dropping. And then ad sales for any of our television networks. As you think about packaging and developing the appropriate package for our clients, we're using analytics for that. Kind of links to the personalization work that we did at Parks and Resorts. But that's a touch on it. At this point, we're almost in every single aspect of the Walt Disney Company. So it's pretty big.
Fantastic. All right, those clearly all sound like very sort of impactful, varied, and sort of important applications of analytics. And I suppose now comes the bad news, which is what happened sort of earlier this year, a few months ago. The world, as we know, sort of changed in COVID. And actually, maybe I'll begin with Aaron and Greg specifically, just because your businesses are very much driven by people going somewhere, doing something, actually sort of moving. I'd love to just begin very broadly to ask the question, what happened? I mean, how did you, what were the challenges in actually taking all these analytics you had set up? And in some cases, you just turned them off. Did you have to modify them? What happened when it hit? And feel free to, I guess, let's carry on with Greg and then I'll move to Aaron.
Well, I think everyone, probably your first assumption when all of this happens is, it's not surprising to say that your historical data is pretty much garbage at this point. But what we tried to do, at least initially, was to try and take things up a level. So if our analytics were being done at a very granular level, we tried to, at least at first, try and move up. And that worked for a moment. And I say a moment because it literally was, days. But once you're at a place where, for us, literally every element of the Parks and Resorts business was shuttered. So once you're at that point, it really becomes a different story. And the traditional analytics that you were doing, you kind of aren't doing that anymore because you're not operating. And so you start and flip it around and you start thinking about, well, what data do I have and what can I do to start thinking about the reopening? So our world changed very, very dramatically from using things we felt relatively effective and comfortable with to challenging literally everything we had and starting to think about what do we need in this new world? What do we need to be building and looking at to get us reopened and get us back on our feet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point you made, actually. I think it's Tracy, actually, one of our alumni, who I think is on the call, actually asked that question about, well, what do we do in the future when we look back? We suddenly have a gap in our data. And I do want to come back to that perhaps a little later, because I think that's a very interesting question. But let me perhaps go to Aaron and ask, I think when it comes to Ava's budget, perhaps almost the opposite problem, and I don't know, you'll tell us, but the idea that, as opposed to Disney Resort, where clearly people weren't able to go, how did this hit you in terms of your algorithms and what you were doing?
Yeah, so very similar story to Greg from the perspective that, our algorithms are built on history. And, when you're, at Ava's budget, we're forecasting the demand of customers, very seasonal aspects to the demand and all that kind of stuff. So, very quickly we could tell, hey, this, there were so many questions like, well, how long is this going to be? Is it a blip or is it is it going to be drug out? Is it, what are all the things that are going to happen? I think what we realized very quickly, so March 12th was when they announced, Final Four, the March Madness is canceled and all that kind of stuff. We saw indications before that, but that was really the day that I think it really hit home for all of us, because Now all of a sudden we had extreme cancellations. We had, where in the rental car industry, you don't get a lot of cancellations because there's not necessarily a penalty for, canceling or for not canceling, you just no show. Well, we saw dramatic cancellations and we saw a lot of different things change just very quick. And so we knew within the first week, things are going to be very different, and we're going to have to figure out now where we've immediately looked is, we are a company that a lot of our business came from inbound airline flights, right? So there were a lot of customers getting off airplanes. Well, we knew, okay, customers are not coming out on airplanes probably for any time soon. So we started looking around and saying, okay, but where are the customers going to be coming from? And we started seeing different behaviors of customers, where previously a customer may not have rented for long durations, but they started renting cars and they wanted to start using those cars, like in Manhattan, to go someplace else. And they were renting for much longer durations. And so what we learned very quickly is our models could not be based on history, but they had to be based on what's happening right here and now. And so we just basically switched all of our models to very responsive models, where it's like, hey, last week gets weighted a whole lot more than 2 weeks ago. And we turned our models, we left the models in the same place, but we just said, ignore seasonality, ignore these things, just pay attention to what's happening in the immediate. And it was amazing. The models just picked up on things and saw things very quickly that we wouldn't have been able to see or respond to. We were seeing cancellation rates have changed, no-show rates have changed. These things are changing, but the models were seeing it and responding and giving good recommendations. And that was something that, there was a shock in March, and it kind of waned through April. By the time we got to May, we actually needed the analytics again. It wasn't just you gotta fly by your seat of your pants. You had to have these models to know, where do we move the cars to? How do we service these customers that are wanting these vehicles? And how do we dig out from operational decisions and other things? And the other thing that really happened very differently is while the demand was subdued, we also saw that the demand for purchasing the vehicles, while it lulled for a little bit, all of a sudden in May and June started really ramping back up. And so then we were like, okay, we've got these cars. We do have customers that want to buy them. Let's figure out a way to get them to the customers that actually want to buy them, since we may not be able to rent them anytime soon. And so we had to just change our focus. And you can see a lot of that in our earnings calls and kind of how we've responded in that. But yeah. So I could talk all day, so I need to let other people talk.
No, I actually find that super fascinating. And just one thing that actually, because one of my questions was going to be sort of, do you just dump all the analytics and fly by the seat of your pants for a bit? And it sounds like you did do that for a little bit. I mean, it sounds like that was necessary. I'm pretty impressed that you say, just quickly before I move on to Ren, I'm curious as to whether algorithms kind of just ready to, because it sounds like you took your analytics, the ones that were being used for this standard environment where you have long histories and so on, and then just somehow adapted them to remove seasonality. How difficult was that process to sort of say, well, you know what, stop looking at a long lag and just look at sort of, a week back? I mean, that doesn't sound trivial to me.
No, it wasn't trivial, and it wasn't that we intentionally necessarily for a month. Like, it took us about a month to just reconfigure the models and to retrain and to really analyze and make sure we weren't going to stick models back out that were going to cause problems. That month of kind of flying by the seat of your pants was more of it was a month where we were relearning what was going on. While the business didn't necessarily need the analytics, we were, I mean, those were the longest days that I think we've ever worked as a team, because we were like, what do we got to do? Because come, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to need these models back up again. And so they were remarkably, I mean, we had a lot of conversations. We figured out, okay, what are the tuning parameters that we can play with? What do we need to do to manipulate them? And I'll be honest with you, we, every couple of months right now, we still go back in and say, okay, now what do we need to retune about these models? Because there's still no seasonality, but there now are starting to develop more patterns that you do need to tweak and update in the model pretty consistently.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me move to you, Ren. Clearly very different part of the industry, but tell us a little bit about what sort of happened when the pandemic hit.
Yeah, well, when the COVID hit, definitely took quite a lot of us by surprise, right? We, as already mentioned by Greg and Aaron, that we rely on historical data a lot as well. One thing we started noticing is truly about some of the customer behavior patterns. I think that's where we start analyzing, is to want to understand, okay, where does those behavior go and what does it mean for us? As you guys may know from the credit risk side, there are some of those delays because of those stimulus package, right? Now, when it comes to provision, would you purely rely on the data you observe right now, or you believe it's going to hit later? So there, we're going to do, in a sense, it's not only your historical data is not fully reliable, even your current data, you wonder how long it's going to last, right? So there will be some kind of sensitivity. Should I purely based on even my new data, or I believe something is going to change? So there will be some judgmental call determining what are you going to do. Now, from customer behavior side, for instance, we started seeing that people taking out loan. Now the question is that, do we believe that money going out? Where does it go, right? And would that actually become investment back, or would that actually become purely a bet? So there's quite a lot of analysis going on from those kind of changing customer behavior, both from acquisition and usage perspective. One thing we leverage is about the human touch. We have the branch manager, right, where we leverage those relationships for them to actually call the customer. From there, in a sense, you can see that that will help mitigate some of the potential risk from the model where you believe may not be quite accurate. And then that kind of feedback will help us tremendously for us to do that. And another part we actually get involved is on the employee side. I don't know whether that holds true for other companies, but that the COVID has a huge impact on our workforce. People started working remotely. So we have done actually quite a lot of analysis to understand the employee, make sure they're safe, make sure, they are getting all of the help needed. So that's something brand new. We've done some before, but very light. And that becomes such a prominent side, understanding people's location and to see how we can still make sure the workplace is good. So that's some of those kind of things. And now the question comes is that how do you do it long run? We get into this stage, it's very clear that it's no longer it's going to be once and done. It may be with us for a while. I think that's where we probably started looking into some of the long-term model, right, which will take, if you're thinking about credit risk side, typically you take 1 year or 1.5 year data, right? It's very hard for you to say, let me jump in right now to adjust my model. You probably don't have enough history for you to do that. Now, with this long run, then we need to start thinking about those kind of model, how do we adjust? So that's some of the dynamic we observe.
Interesting. So I want to pick up one thing you said, which is this idea of branch managers and using them kind of the human touch to augment. How do you think about, and this is not just really COVID specific, how do you think about combining that kind of human touch and with algorithms and tell you about the particular person? What's kind of the approach there?
Yeah, I truly believe that if you're thinking about analytics AI, the best way for you to maximize the benefit of it is make it an augment of the human touch instead of make it a complete replacing human. Just like in this kind of crisis, when you think about it, it's very hard sometimes for machine to learn when there's no history, but it may be very easy for human to identify some of the challenges. So feeding the insights, even the most latest insights to the human and ask them to take judgments. I think that's the best way. And one thing they learn about it is to come back and say where your model is doing well, where it's not. That kind of feedback loop is going to become extremely valuable. We've done that even before, I would say, before the COVID. Whenever our model, we feel that we're doing something brand new. For instance, we did a facial recognition for criminal identification, identify common criminal behind similar, fraud accounts. When we did that, when it's first time we're doing it, we always make sure that we never systematically take action. You always send for human to review. And when whatever they do, gradually you increase where you are confident to take some automation. So COVID is just shorten the whole cycle of test and learn, right? You just constantly need to double check and make sure that bring in the human factor whenever you're not confident.
That makes a lot of sense, the idea of the feedback. Thank you. Let's move on to you, Wei. I mean, you sort of, one of the world experts in pricing. You've seen a lot of industries try and do pricing. What has happened in the last few months?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, actually, the previous panelists have already kind of touched on some of the common themes. I think one thing I will call out, just to echo what Ryan has just said, one is frequency of updating any models or analytics so that you can actually make decisions on a much more rapid basis. Like, the earlier example that I mentioned on, kind of understanding customer so-called flow of funds behavior, meaning how you actually move money between different accounts in the financial services world. The industry pre-pandemic used to do this on a monthly basis. Well, why? Because you have a monthly statement right from your bank, and that's usually when data gets updated. And as you can imagine, during pandemic, you would actually really have to dramatically ramp up the frequency of the updates. So we've seen some of the more successful financial institutions move to a daily update of how the money is actually done. But that may sound trivial to everyone. It's intuitive, but actually surprisingly difficult to do because the data on the back end is actually not designed originally to update on a daily frequency. So there's actually a whole bunch of data work that you have to do before you actually get to the analytics, right? And that's one thing. And the other is that I have this hypothesis that maybe when you have these type of black swan events hitting, kind of dragging the whole industry down. Unfortunately, that's sort of to Aaron's industry a little bit, in the broader travel world, and to a certain extent to Greg's industry. And then on the other side, you have financial services, which seems to fare well, fairly well, or at least, it wasn't badly hit during the pandemic. When you have these type of broad brush issues happening, maybe the focus is not on, kind of any sophisticated models that eke out the next percentage, like 1 or 2% of extra revenue uplift, because you're either in an existential crisis or not. Rather, to Ren's point earlier, that there's analytics, and you put information in front of people so that they can make some good judgment calls, because the machines are not yet kind of keeping up, right? So I think that there's you won't usually hear from me, because I'm a huge advocate of building sophisticated models to aid human decision making. But I think in this particular case, I don't think we have. You probably don't have the time to deploy and actually develop these very sophisticated models. So relying on human judgment calls would be a good thing to do. So I think that so if I look at it this way, just kind of coming back to your original question, what are some of those industries doing? At the end of the day, the more successful ones, regardless of industries, are able to move quickly to essentially not rely on historical models, which are built on a much lower frequency of updates, and in fact increasing the frequency of updates, and then not completely rely on the machines to make judgment calls.
No, that's fascinating. And that's actually a point I want to pick you up on, and then perhaps expand. I'll ask you first, Wei, and then expand to the rest of the audience, of the panel, I'm sorry. I think what strikes me a lot about this topic when I thought about it, and sort of what I wanted to ask in this panel, is that in some ways, what we're discussing here is a very sharp change in reality. The reality used to be this way, now it's this way. But in some ways, changes in reality are not unprecedented. I mean, if we think of sort of, all of our industry, the way people visited Disney parks 20 years ago compared to now, the way people rented cars 20 years ago versus now, clearly has changed. It's clearly not the same. And so more broadly, Wei, do you think in some sense this has taught us anything about how after the pandemic, we should alter our models, update them? And you mentioned the idea of sort of, instead of monthly, doing it at a daily level. Do you think there's anything more? Do you think now there's a way that companies will now, always sort of think of updating their models in more detail, or sort of anything like that?
Yeah, maybe I just put out two things. One is there's been a lot of talk about data, right? Obviously, and a couple of years ago it was big data. Nobody talks about big data, by the way, as a buzzword anymore. I guess that's gone out of fashion. But the whole point is, what is your data infrastructure, and how do you actually, build a data infrastructure to enable analytics? I found across the several industries I've done consulting work for, there tends to be a lack of an overarching strategic objective on what you're actually building for. So it's all about like here's a new server farm that you can buy, and then you put a bunch of Hadoop or whatever keyword buzzword of the day on the system, and then you call it a day. You think that you have actually that capability, but actually what is the objective of you're solving for? So I think that's one thing just to call attention to. And then the other is, if you think about what you just said, I think there's acute changes, like when a shock like this happens in behavior, that you do have to take note of, and everyone knows in that moment not to rely on models and data that doesn't necessarily reflect the current reality. But over time, of course, things will go back to whether you call it the new normal or the next normal or whatever. That over time shift is sort of similar to what you just described. I mean, the reality has been shifting over time. So of course, many industries will use a rolling window of data going forward and to slowly update the model. I think that's important to know. I have a controversial remark, which I'm about to make, because I'm not making any friends with data scientists in the world, is I do find that at least the current emphasis, and it's sort of not necessarily doing justice to reflect the whole reality, but just the point is, a lot of the data science teaching and emphasis so far has been mostly about the kitchen sink approach of kind of throwing data at a bunch of let's say common methodological frameworks, without actually thinking about the modeling structure behind these things, like what is actually driving the behavior of the customer, as opposed to here's a bunch of data, you throw it at the machine and see what the machine comes up with. I feel like when you have a crisis moment like this, it actually places emphasis on how you think about behavior and how you actually model that behavior before you actually throw the kitchen sink of data at the computer.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's actually move to you, Aaron. All those late nights, are they going to be worth something after the pandemic? Is there sort of any systemic change you think you'll make to the way you do analytics? Both, the example I mentioned was updating models more regularly, but is there anything you've learned that you think will have staying power?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that we learned that will definitely, you just have to be honest with yourself, right? This was, like everybody said, there was a shock to the system, right? And shock to the systems can be good or bad depending on ultimately what you do with them, right? And so from, when I look at what Avis Budget has done and how we've kind of responded to this, and I'm not just talking about our analytics organization, I'm talking about the organization as a whole. Everybody has, I think the attention has been, hey guys, we can't read tea leaves. We can't look at a crystal ball. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we do have a lot of data and a lot of analytics potential that's out there. And so what I think this has really helped us with is I think people are now realizing, like, there are decisions that need to be made very quickly, and there's a good way to do it with analytics, right? And the one thing I can tell you that we had already started kind of heading down this path, but this really accelerated there, which is when we're building models into the future, we need to build them. You have to build the models in mind, like what Wei was just saying. You can't just throw the kitchen sink in there and say, hey, let's, you do find a lot of data scientists out there going, I want to build the most sophisticated model that uses every bell and whistle that I've ever heard, right? Well, it's like, okay, but how much value is that going to deliver to the business, and how long will it take to get to the business? What our focus has now shifted to is, if you've got an opportunity that can be delivered this week to the business, and it's, maybe worth, a few $1,000s, or something that's promising, but it's 3 months from now and it may be $20,000. It's like, go get the now, because there's no guarantee that 3 months from now you're going to be able to get that. Now, that doesn't mean you always operate short-sighted, but it does mean in this world, you got to take the opportunities that are in front of you, get the models out there quick, and then build on them. And at some point, we can kind of come back to, we have had a little bit of a philosophical shift also about the leveraging of challenger models to existing models and how we're kind of starting to piece those two together, kind of like what a hurricane model does. But we can kind of jump back to that once other people have talked about this.
Sure, fascinating.
Yeah.
And then maybe, since we're talking about changes, let's go back, Greg, to the issue we were talking about before, which is, hopefully, fingers crossed, all Disney parks and resorts are going to be reopened very, very soon. Once, this nightmare is over, you're now going to have a year and a half of missing data, or more or less, or sort of, whatever it was. What are you going to do with that?
Yeah, the missing data, I think a lot of it has already kind of been touched on. The missing data is going to be, frankly, a lot of it is going to be hopefully censored. So a lot of this is going to be periods where, look, the consumer was not behaving the way they're going to behave in the other side of this. Hopefully, I think that we'll ultimately have to censor a lot of data. Probably coming out of this, you'll continue to have all of your models learning very quickly, as Aaron kind of alluded to. Because I think that as we come out of it, the new normal isn't going to be reached incredibly quickly. It's going to be this period of change over time where your models are still going to have to be learning and adjusting. So we'll definitely have to do some of that and continue to monitor how our models are working in this, quote, new normal. I think the other thing, kind of touching back on the previous discussion, there's a lot of places, and I may take Wei's controversial statement a little further. There's a lot of places where right now we don't know how the consumer is going to react to something. So it's not even appropriate for us to think about building sophisticated models. What we're thinking about is, can you build something that is good enough and really focus on kind of that execution layer. So the best example I can give you, if you ever visited a Disney park, up until now, you've never had to make a reservation to get into that park. Well, now you do. And so that's a whole new set of data that is going to be there. And we don't have time to build the underlying sophisticated models for that. We had a target of we're going to reopen. And so really what we were focused on was the front end, the execution layer. And where I was focused on was, okay, that's great. Let's build that. But please remember, eventually I want to come in behind you and I want to put in a more sophisticated model. So don't build something that I can't, plug into. So I think there's going to be a lot of, when we come out of this, there's going to be a lot of looking at all the new things that are out there and the new opportunities and figuring out what's the right prioritization of where do I go first? Where do I work first? Because I don't think there's going to be a lack of opportunities in the world.
I actually find that quite fascinating. This idea of saying, well, we know we're going to have a rapidly changing environment, so we have to kind of take one bite at a time instead of looking at a reality and trying to build around that. And I'm trying to think, and you've already told us sort of a bunch here, but do you still expect to be working with an approach where you just retrain the model at shorter intervals, or is there sort of a whole different approach you expect to be adopting to kind of deal with the fact that reality is changing under your feet as you go?
Well, on the resort side, I think we expect to be dealing with our existing models where we're not going to throw them out. We think that our models are adaptable enough that we'll be able to get through it. I think the bigger challenge for us is going to be all of the new things and trying to figure out how do we, because resorts no one comes to a Disney park to stay in our resorts. I mean, they're nice, but the reason you go is to go to the parks, right? And so there's so many different places where we have to understand the behaviors and how people are thinking about going to a theme park. For us on the resort and the theme park side, we now have a new constraint we've never had before, and that is park capacity. Historically, we never ever thought about park capacity. Well, that's a constraint that goes in not only to your theme park models, but to your resort models, because if my parks are constrained, I'm not going to be selling very many resorts because, like I said, no one comes to stay in our resorts. So a lot of different things that we'll have to do. Like I said, it's you mentioned earlier, it's not a trivial piece of work to do, but fortunately, I think the models that we have are receptive to that.
Absolutely. Ren, Betsy actually asks in the Q&A, she wants to hear a little more about the analysis of employee data you spoke about. And I'm going to kind of extend that question since we're on a theme of talking about, what's going to change in the future and how we have used this period to learn what we want to do. Are these employee models something you think you would use permanently now? Is there something about them that you found useful in that respect?
Yeah, you're talking about the employee side of the model, or?
Yeah, so the models you mentioned where, employees are working from home and you have some sort of analytics involved in figuring out the impact that has, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I would say at this stage, it's less about model building. It's more about analysis to understanding the impact of it. Similar to many other areas we do analysis, it's just understanding the behavior change compared with before to see if there's anything we can do about it and what are some of the drivers. And I do want to echo what we mentioned earlier. And lots of time is that when you are building or looking at those analysis, is thinking about what are some of the key driver components. If you cover those driver components well, your model may need tweaks, but probably won't be a disaster completely collapse, right? If you're thinking about what are those kind of things. So from the employee side, we're looking to more about their behavior pattern change, their working pattern change, but more in the sense is that how we can help them better from that angle.
That makes sense. There is not much love for all complex kitchen sink modeling in this room, I think. I think that's the one thing we can take away from our discussion. Let me ask you another question, which might be equally controversial way, and I'm not going to pick on any one of you, so I'll let one of you volunteer if you think the answer is yes. At any point in this, pandemic, did any of you just sit there and think like, man, we've been relying on models too much? Like, I just wish there'd been a little more. I think, and to give you an analog, I think people definitely have been thinking that when it comes to things like just-in-time supply chain management. That's a very popular topic when it comes to operations and supply chain. People have definitely stepped back and been like, wow, I wish we'd sort of, gone a little less just in time. Do you think there's an analog for the kind of analytics we've been talking about where it was just a little too much and we should probably rethink that? Or do you think that, is not part of this?
Let me actually jump in on this.
Yeah.
Because I've had some discussion with people around here. My belief actually is the opposite. I don't feel with this that we are overusing model. I feel this pandemic probably shows that data analysis or AI truly have a room to grow because when you are thinking about those uncertainty, right, nothing really you can, no matter how good you plan, right, it may, in this kind of case, no longer works. I think the analysis or AI help you to adapt quicker, learn quicker. The question is that how you do it. It's not about that. I think the model itself is not as good. It's about how we use it. For instance, if you have the right system to allow the model to self-learn and adapt and to make sure it's going to bring in the human when the model is not confident, when they realize they constantly monitoring, find out, okay, not necessarily I constantly need to review, but I constantly monitoring how healthy this model is and bring in a human saying something is not right, somebody need to check, you will be fine. It's about building that right system to self-monitoring and augment with human. If without that, purely blind rely on model and analytics, then that's not where to go. So it doesn't mean we should rely on less. I think we should rely on more, but rely on it in a healthy and smart way.
I like that. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'd add to what Ren was saying. I think one of the things that we've seen before is when you put in or even propose a rather sophisticated model to do something, one of the first reactions you'll get from people is, oh, great, so we can eliminate X number of people because now the model does it. But what this, to me, it brings up is not that we've gone too far on analytics, but this re-emphasizes the importance of having qualified people monitoring those models, knowing when you should adjust them and tweak them.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is interesting to think about is, and Greg mentioned that earlier, the fact that you're able to capture new data in this and that capability is not a transient one, meaning, you know, you build that capability, right? You actually acted quickly to build that capability. So that should in some way kind of dictate what kind of models you want to be building. So this notion that, I mean, I forgot who said it, but someone said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think that was a pretty famous quote. And well, so in other words, like, you know, we don't rely on models to tell us everything. We don't rely on machines to tell us everything. You know, on the one hand, on the other hand, you know, recognizing that new data and new opportunities created by new data in this environment could actually be used to improve the models further. And I think that would be very interesting to think about.
And just to add on top of that, I think across the board everybody said no, so I would agree. I don't think we rely on models too much, but I do think that we have a bias towards advanced techniques a lot of times, and I also think that we have a tendency to fall in love with the model rather than the results. And I think a lot of times people will be focused on, oh man, look at this advanced model that I built, rather than what's the impact that it's having and how, you know, how much value is it delivering. And I think that's something that, you know, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, one of the things that we've really gotten into is not, you know, Greg mentioned you've got to have the right people monitoring the models, and I 100% agree with that. You've got to have people monitoring models. We also have started having models monitor the models, where we are getting into a place where you can put an advanced technique out there, but you need challenger models. You need things watching these models, because some of these models are getting so sophisticated that even people watching the models may not be able to see what's going wrong. And so one of the things we're doing is we're putting, like, if you think of like the hurricane cone of uncertainty, they run, you know, 15 different models showing it's all going this way. If all the models are pointing one way, that cone's really tight. If the models are going other ways, it's you know, pretty wide. We're trying to do the same thing with techniques, where it's like, hey, when we build a model, how are you going to monitor it? Because you can't throw that over to a business team and say, you've got to monitor it and influence it when it's wrong. You may not know it's wrong in time before it has a business impact. You've got to have other things watching that. And I think that's important, you know, and that starts to alleviate some of that bias towards advanced techniques as well, because you can throw some simpler stuff out there, and if they're pointing you in a different direction, you do have to question the model you've fallen in love with, right?
Right. No, I love that they got the idea of sort of, you know, falling in love with the results rather than the model. I think that's a very good way to put it. So maybe the last thing, since we all spoke about the idea of, you know, having the right people monitoring the models, working with them. Last question I'll ask before I move to some Q&A. A lot of our students on the school, certainly a lot of our MBA students, absolutely want to be involved in analytics. They realize that is the direction the world is moving. They realize that's the way to create value for the companies they're going to be in, but they might not be the most technical people themselves. It sounds like, based on what you're saying, there's definitely room for them, right? In terms of being those sort of business people who help implement those models. What advice would you have? What kind of skills do they need to develop? How do they become good sort of, you know, analytics translators, for example? Greg, I see you unmuted, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, it's just one because I'm relatively passionate, because I am a non-technical, and I don't build models, but you know, there is a base level of mathematic understanding that has to be there. But you know, I think that's the place where it becomes important, is go to the places that you don't know and try to learn. I mean, where I add value is bringing that business lens to the model. So, you know, I'm able to look at it and I'm able to say, well, you know, this doesn't make sense because this is how the business will perform. So but I can't do that if I don't have some baseline level of understanding of the modeling. So I have to at least be able to talk with the scientists, knowing and deferring to them on the technical, because I clearly don't go there. But that allows them to be able to then rely on me for the business. So, you know, you don't have to be an expert. You just have to have a little bit of understanding, and then know where your value is. I think a lot of times as business people, when you're put in a room with the data scientists and the people who are building these complex models, you walk in there with an inferiority complex because I can't do that. But the reality is there's a lot that you bring to the table that they can't do. And so you have to value what you bring to the table.
Makes a lot of sense. Any other thoughts on that? Yes.
If I may add to that, that's also one topic I'm very passionate about. I truly believe in this world that analytical skill or data science AI skill is growing extremely fast. However, I feel what's missing or what is in high demand is a translation skill, the bridge either between business to modeling analytics or between the model to the technology world. I think that kind of a bridge, the translator, that's what I call them, or the glue, is extremely important. So in my team, for instance, I specifically have a team we call Acceleration Office. And those are the people who work closely with the business, and then they can also understanding the machine learning language, working with the data scientists. As we all know, lots of time that knowing what is the right problem to solve probably is the most important question to ask. And solving them is important. However, that probably takes 20% of your time. If you define the wrong problem, you're completely on the wrong track. And we're relying on that kind of a translator to working with the business to see what is the business problem and how do we translate that into the right analytical problem to solve, and then working with the team. So I think for people with this kind of business background, they can be a perfect translator if they also know the data science part, and that will be extremely valuable skill in high demand in today's world. I'm sure it's going to be in tomorrow's world, and particularly in the leadership position.
That makes a lot of sense.
We often say that in our projects, if we're going to fail, the place we will fail is in the integration piece, taking the model and attaching it to the business in a way that the business will actually use it. And so I think having that translator is one of the most important things. You can build the most sophisticated model, but if no one's going to use it, it's of no value.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, thank you both for that. So unless there are any other sort of, yes, Wei, I see you unmuted.
No, just one point. I think I fully agree. I mean, of course, if the best both worlds, if you know both, that's perfect. I recognize not everyone can, pick up technical skills overnight either. So I do think if you have business intuitions, by all means, you should, kind of understand at least the basics of technical skills, right? I think that I agree with all the panelists. But to Greg's point, there's one thing that's interesting to think about is we tend to place emphasis on the theoretical value of models, or you build the next optimization engine for pricing, or the next dynamic pricing engine, and that can give you all these sophisticated, very granular pricing recommendations. That's all great, but if you cannot execute on it, so and here is not just about that. There are two aspects of execution. There's the fact that, let's say you have thousands of pricing cells, meaning your price points will change depending on how granular your segmentation is. That changes by the second, because certain industries are like that. Well, how do you actually execute on this from a technology standpoint? So can you actually push it out to the customer contact point? That's one thing. That's the technology side of things. And the other side is the human side of things, right? So you have industries where you have moved to very sophisticated analytics that drive very sophisticated business decisions, including pricing decisions. But then it's still human to human interactions at a point of sale. Well, how do you actually enable that salesperson? And on the one hand, on the other hand, how do you actually control the behavior of the salesperson? Because that person doesn't necessarily have to follow the recommendations of the engine. I remember back in the day when I did a case study for one of the largest department stores, and they were using a dynamic pricing engine, and we found that the compliance rate from these buyers, in the department store that followed the machine's recommendation was only at 45%. Well, okay, it might actually already be high for that industry, but still, it's 45% of the recommendations are based on machine recommendations.
The algorithm was telling them to price as X, and they were pricing as something completely different.
Completely different, right? Yeah. So I think let's not forget about the human aspect. So while we want to make models more relevant, to solving the problem we have on hand, let's not forget about the human side of the implementation as well as the technology side.
Oh, wonderful. Let me try and get to one or two of these questions. I know we only have 4 minutes left. I have a question here for Greg from Robert saying, Disney has a multitude of verticals, and judging by the number of SKUs, also clearly a very big retailer. Do you have any best practices on how the different groups share data for a variety of use cases? And specifically also when it comes to COVID, there clearly is a lot of interrelationship between these different SKUs. Do you share data? Do you operate in a siloed way? How do you address that issue?
Well, the one question I can't address specifically, but I will say I think some of the best practices really are having that layer that kind of crosses the different verticals. That's one of the areas where and why the group that I'm a part of, why we feel like we've been successful is we've been able to play that role. We do work with the theatrical group. We do work with ABC, with the studio, within Parks and Resorts, obviously. And so doing that and the way we've kind of constructed our organization, it's not necessarily based on segment. You're not necessarily a theme parks expert per se, but you are a personalization expert. And so that means that you may be working on personalization projects in Parks and Resorts while at the same time you're doing it over for the studios. So having that person who's now seeing that same problem across the different segments, that helps a lot. So that's really hard to do when you have a large organization, but I think that's the place that's been allowed us to be successful.
Wonderful. I see another question here from David, and I'm assuming he means generally or, with respect to the pandemic. Answer the question either way. He asks, if you had to grade your usage of analytics, how effective do you think you're doing? So from 0 to 100, 100 is you could be, you are exactly where you want to be. Answer this question how you will, but let's maybe rephrase it. And what do you think is the one thing if you had a magic wand that you would sort of, improve? And maybe let me go to Aaron for that one. What's the sort of cutting edge in terms of improving what you're doing right now?
Oh gosh, I mean that's a tough one. I mean my personality is very much always look for improvement. I have to stop and make sure to celebrate what's there.
So you're in the right job for that kind of personality, I think.
Yeah. Improving. Exactly. So it's if I was trying to think what would be the biggest thing I could improve that I could share. I think it really does go back to don't fall in love with your models. Make sure that you are constantly questioning. And this is one thing I would say for any data scientist out there, for any business person out there, when you complete a project or when you're working on a project, don't let other people be your biggest critics. Be your own biggest critic. Critique what you're doing and look for flaws in what you're doing before you put it out there, and everything else will take care of itself. I see a lot of problems when people are like, I got this model and look, it works. And you open it up and you're like, no, that's wrong in 2 minutes, and you lose credibility. So that's what I'd say there.
Yep. Well, I think that's all we have time for. I want to thank all our attendees for joining us here today. It was a pleasure. If you have any stories of your own from your companies about analytics in the time of Corona, please do send them our way. You can find my email address pretty easily. I would love to hear about it, feature it on our website. It leaves me to thank so much Wei, Greg, Aaron, and Ren. Thank you so much. I know, if this discussion has brought anything out, is that you all are very busy people right now. It's a very, very busy time. And I'm so grateful you would have taken this time to speak to us. This was truly fascinating to me. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.